My name is Arthur Coleman. I'm 62 years old, and for 35 of those years, I was a fish and wildlife officer with the Virginia Department of Wildlife Resources. I've spent more of my life in the woods than out of them. I know the cry of a painter, what we call a panther, even though the official books say they're not here. I know the difference between a black bear bluff charge and a real one. I can tell you the weight of a buck by the depth of its track in soft mud. I say all this not to boast, but to establish a baseline. I am not a man given to flights of fancy. I am grounded in the soil and the seasons of this state. What I'm about to tell you is true, and it is the reason I will never again set foot in the woods I once called home. The story begins, as so many do, with a simple plan. A weekend away from the noise of town. I own a small cabin, or I did, on a piece of land that borders the Great Dismal Swamp National Wildlife Refuge.
It wasn't deep in the swamp, not the true, impassable morass, but on the fringe, where the loblolly pines and sweet gums start to give way to the cypress and black gum. It was isolated. A 5-mile gravel road, more of a glorified logging trace, was the only way in or out. It was my sanctuary. A place to fish the feeder creeks, listen to the owls, and feel the world slow down. That October, my son-in-law, Jake, asked if he could bring a friend from his engineering firm for a weekend at the cabin. I was happy to have them. Jake is a good man, steady and capable. He married my daughter, Alyssa, 7 years ago, and I couldn't have picked a better husband for her myself. He'd been coming to the cabin with me since they were dating. He knew how to handle a shotgun, how to read a compass, and most importantly, how to be quiet and just exist in nature. His friend Brian was another story. He was a city guy, born and raised in Richmond. Loud, affable, always ready with a joke.
He viewed the trip as a kind of novelty, a rustic adventure. He showed up in brand new hiking boots that were clearly stiff and uncomfortable, and a backpack filled with more gadgets than practical supplies. I liked him in the way you like an enthusiastic puppy, but I could tell the profound silence of the woods was something he was eager to fill with noise. We arrived on a Friday afternoon. The air was crisp, holding the first real chill of autumn. The leaves were turning, a riot of gold and crimson against the dark green of the pines. We unpacked the truck, and Brian was immediately impressed by the cabin. It wasn't much, just one large room with a stone fireplace, a small kitchenette, and a sleeping loft. The walls were thick, built from cypress logs I'd helped my own father cut and place 50 years ago. It had a heavy oak door and solid, single-pane windows with thick wooden shutters we could bolt from the inside. It was built to withstand a hurricane, a fortress against the elements. As the sun started to dip below the tree line, casting long, skeletal shadows across the clearing, I started a fire in the outdoor pit. Jake was splitting firewood, the rhythmic thwack of the axe a familiar and comforting sound. Brian was trying to get a cell signal, wandering around the clearing with his phone held high, a comical look of frustration on his face. "No bars, Art. How do you live like this?" he'd called out. I just smiled. That was the whole point. We grilled steaks and drank a couple of beers. The talk was easy. Work, sports, Alyssa's latest promotion. The typical things men talk about when they're trying to unwind. As darkness fell completely, the swamp came alive with its nightly chorus. The chirping of crickets, the deep juggarum of the bullfrogs, the distant hoot of a barred owl. It was a symphony I knew by heart. Brian, despite his city nature, seemed to be settling in. He was quieter now, staring into the flames, mesmerized by the dance of the embers. "It really is peaceful out here," he said, his voice softer than I'd heard it all day. "I get it now."
Jake clapped him on the shoulder. Told you. Just wait until tomorrow. Art knows a spot on the creek where the bass are practically jumping into the boat. We stayed out by the fire until the chill started to seep into our bones. Around 10, we doused the flames and headed inside. We bolted the door, a habit so ingrained in me I did it without thinking. We left the shutters open to let the moonlight in. It was a clear night, and the moon was nearly full, bathing the clearing in a pale, silvery light. We settled into our bunks, me and Jake in the loft, Brian on the pull-out cot near the fireplace. The familiar sounds of the night were a lullaby, and I drifted off to sleep easily. The first wrong thing happened around 2 a.m. I was pulled from sleep by a sound. It wasn't one of the familiar night sounds. It was low, guttural, and it carried a weight, a resonance that made the small hairs on my arms stand up. It wasn't a bear's huff or a coyote's yip. It was a single, drawn-out growl that seemed to come from all directions at once and vibrate right through the logs of the cabin. I lay perfectly still, my eyes wide open in the darkness, straining my ears. The swamp had gone silent. Utterly, unnaturally silent. No crickets, no frogs, no owls. Just a dead, waiting quiet. Then came the thump. It was a solid, heavy impact against the back wall of the cabin, the one that faced the deepest part of the woods. It wasn't like something had fallen against it. It felt like something had struck it. Hard. Down below, I heard Brian stir. "What was that?" he whispered, his voice tight with alarm. I heard Jake shift in his bunk across the loft. "Probably just a deer," he said, his voice thick with sleep. "Maybe stumbled into the wall." I knew it wasn't a deer. A deer is a creature of grace and panic. It might crash through brush, but it wouldn't deliberately strike a building. This was heavy, solid. I slipped out of my bunk, my bare feet silent on the wooden floor. I crept to the loft railing and looked down. Brian was sitting up on his cot, a pale shape in the moonlight slanting through the window. "Art?" he said, his voice barely a whisper. "Stay put," I murmured. I grabbed the heavy mag light I always kept by my bed and went down the ladder. The silence outside was the most unsettling part. It was a void, a complete absence of the life that should have been there. It felt like the entire forest was holding its breath. "Should we look outside?" Brian asked, his earlier bravado completely gone. "No," I said, my voice firm. "There's nothing to be gained by wandering around in the dark. If it's a bear, it'll move on." Even as I said it, I didn't believe it. A bear would have been noisy. It would have snuffled, pawed at the trash can, made its presence known. This was different. This was stealthy. We stood there for what felt like an hour, just listening to the crushing silence. Finally, tentatively, a lone cricket started to chirp. Then another. Slowly, the symphony of the swamp faded back in, as if a switch had been flipped. The tension in the room eased, but not for me. The feeling of wrongness lingered, a cold knot in my stomach. We eventually went back to bed, but I didn't sleep. I lay awake, listening, until the first gray light of dawn touched the sky. The next morning, Brian was back to his usual self, making jokes about the dismal swamp monster coming to visit. He was trying to cover his fear with humor, a common enough reaction. Jake was quiet, thoughtful. He caught my eye as we were making coffee. He knew something was off too. "You think it was a bear, Art?" he asked, keeping his voice low so Brian wouldn't hear. "Don't know what it was," I admitted, "but I don't like it." The woods went dead silent. That only happens for one of two reasons: a hunter or a predator far up the food chain. After a quick breakfast, I went outside to inspect the cabin. I walked around to the back wall where we'd heard the impact. There was nothing. No broken wood, no scuff marks, not even a dent in the old cypress logs. I checked the ground. The leaf litter was thick and dry, impossible to get a clear print from unless the creature was immensely heavy. I found nothing. It was as if it had never happened. Then I saw the picnic table. It was a massive thing made of solid oak that sat on the small wooden porch at the front of the cabin. It took 4 men to move it into place years ago. Now it was 3 feet to the left of where it had been. I stared at it, a cold feeling washing over me. Deep, parallel gouges were scraped into the wooden planks of the porch, showing where the table's feet had been dragged. Not pushed, dragged. I called Jake over. He looked at the table, then at the scrape marks, then back at the table. His face was pale. "No bear did that," he said, his voice flat. "No," I agreed. "A bear would have tried to tip it over looking for food. It would have splintered the top. This was just moved. Purposefully." Brian came out, saw us staring, and sauntered over. "Whoa, who decided to redecorate?" He bent down and looked at the scrapes. "Seriously, what could do that? A bear?" "We don't think so," Jake said, his eyes still locked on the table. Brian's joking demeanor faltered. He looked from the table to the dark tree line and back again. "So, what then? A couple of strong guys playing a prank?" "Who?" I asked him. "We're 5 miles from a paved road. The gate at the entrance is locked. We didn't see another vehicle on the way in. Who is coming all the way out here in the middle of the night to drag a 500-pound table 3 feet to the left?" He had no answer. None of us did. The unease from the night before returned, tenfold. The rest of the day was spent in a state of low-grade anxiety. We decided against going fishing. The idea of being out on the water, away from the relative safety of the cabin, was suddenly unappealing. We stayed close, cleaning our fishing gear, organizing the supplies inside. Brian tried to keep the mood light, but his jokes fell flat. We all found ourselves casting nervous glances towards the woods. As evening approached, a decision had to be made. Part of me, the rational 35-year veteran officer part, wanted to pack up and leave. But another part, the stubborn, prideful part, refused to be chased out of my own woods by a shadow. And what would we say? We were spooked by a noise and a moved table? Jake felt the same. He was a man who didn't back down from a problem. Brian, surprisingly, was the one who voiced what we were all thinking. "Maybe we should just go," he said, staring out the window as the sun began to set. "This feels weird." "We're fine," Jake said, though his voice lacked conviction. "We'll lock the place down tight tonight. We have the shotguns." I agreed, against my better judgment. It was a decision that would haunt me for the rest of my life. That night, we didn't just bolt the door. We closed and bolted the heavy wooden shutters over every window as well. The cabin was plunged into a thick, claustrophobic darkness, lit only by a single kerosene lamp on the table. The silence outside was absolute from the moment the sun went down. The swamp was holding its breath again. We sat around the main table, the 12-gauge pump shotgun I kept in the cabin, and Jake's own Remington 870 lying on the wood between us. We didn't talk much. We just listened. For an hour, there was nothing but the soft hiss of the lamp and the sound of our own breathing. Then it started, a faint scraping sound from the front of the cabin. It was the sound of something hard and sharp being dragged across the wooden shutters of the window next to the door. It was slow, deliberate. Scrape. Pause. Scrape. My blood ran cold. It wasn't the sound of an animal's claws. It sounded like metal on wood, or perhaps stone. Brian's eyes were wide in the lamplight, fixed on the shuttered window. Jake had his hand on his shotgun, his knuckles white. The scraping stopped. We waited, every muscle tensed. Then we heard a new sound, one that was infinitely more terrifying. Click. Jiggle. It was the sound of the doorknob. The heavy iron handle on the outside of the oak door was being turned, slowly, back and forth. Something was standing on my porch, 30 inches from where we sat, and it was trying to open the door. It wasn't rattling it, not trying to force it. It was testing it as a person would, as something intelligent would. Brian let out a small, choked gasp. Jake silently racked a shell into the chamber of his Remington. The sound was deafening in the small space. The jiggling stopped. A low growl rumbled through the door, so deep it was more of a vibration in my chest than a sound. It was the same growl I'd heard the night before, but now it was right there, on the other side of 3 inches of oak. I picked up my own shotgun, the familiar weight a small comfort. My mind was racing, trying to fit this into some logical framework. A person? A deranged hermit? No person could have moved that table. A bear? A bear doesn't turn doorknobs. Every logical explanation was stripped away, leaving only the terrifying, impossible truth. Something unknown was outside, and it wanted to get in. "Art," Jake whispered, his voice trembling slightly. "What do we do?" "We wait," I said, my own voice tight. "Don't make a sound." Minutes stretched into an eternity. The growling subsided, replaced again by that oppressive silence. I found myself straining to hear, to catch any hint of movement. A sniff, a footstep, anything. There was only the hiss of the lamp. My heart was hammering against my ribs. I had to see. I had to know what we were dealing with. The window on the far side of the cabin, the one overlooking the side yard and the woodpile, had a small peephole drilled into its shutter, a modification I'd made years ago for spotting deer. Gesturing for Jake and Brian to stay quiet, I crept across the room, my shotgun held at the ready. My hands were slick with sweat as I put my eye to the small hole. At first, I saw nothing but the moonlit clearing, the dark shapes of the trees. It was still out there. The dead silence of the swamp was proof of that. I scanned the tree line, my eye tracing the edge of the darkness. And then I saw it. It was standing just inside the shadow of a large water oak, about 50 yards from the cabin. It was a shape, a silhouette, but its form was unmistakable and utterly wrong. It was huge, standing on 2 legs. It had to be over 7 feet tall, with a massive, broad torso and shoulders that were impossibly wide. It was just standing there, motionless, watching the cabin. As I watched, it shifted its weight, and its head turned slightly, giving me a partial profile against the moonlight. The head was long and tapered, with a distinct muzzle and tall, pointed ears. It was the head of a wolf or a dog, perched atop a hulking, man-like body. A wave of primal fear, cold and absolute, washed over me. I felt my breath catch in my throat. I had spent a lifetime in these woods. I had seen everything this ecosystem had to offer. This was not part of it. This was an intruder, an impossibility. It moved again, taking a single silent step out of the shadows. Its arms were long, hanging almost to its knees, and they ended in what looked like large, dark hands. The proportions were all wrong. It was a grotesque mockery of both man and beast. I stumbled back from the shutter, my mind reeling. Jake looked at me, his face a mask of anxious questions. "What did you see?" he breathed.
I couldn't form the words. I just shook my head, my eyes wide with a terror I had never known. "Get ready," I finally managed to choke out. "It's big." That was when the power cut. The generator I had running out back, which powered the cabin's few lights and outlets, sputtered and died. The kerosene lamp on the table was suddenly our only source of light, casting flickering, distorted shadows that danced on the walls. The sudden plunge into near darkness was disorienting, and in that moment of confusion, the creature struck. There was a sound like a car crash as the entire window frame next to the front door exploded inward. Wood, glass, and shutter splinters flew across the room. Framed in the gaping hole, silhouetted against the moonlight, stood the thing I had seen in the tree line. It was even bigger up close. Its fur was dark and matted, thick around its neck and shoulders like a mane. Its legs were bent at an unnatural angle, like a dog's, with the hocks positioned halfway down the limb. The smell that rolled in with it was overpowering, a foul mix of wet dog, rot, and something metallic, like old blood. Its head turned, and its eyes found us. They were intelligent, and they glowed with a faint, predatory amber light. It wasn't the reflected eyeshine of a nocturnal animal. They seemed to generate their own faint luminescence.
It opened its long muzzle and let out a sound that I will hear in my nightmares until the day I die.
It was a high-pitched shriek that tore through a low, rumbling growl, a sound of pure, unrestrained violence. For a frozen second, none of us moved. We were paralyzed by the sheer impossibility of what we were seeing. Brian was the first to break. He screamed, a raw, terrified sound, and scrambled backward, away from the window. He tried to run for the kitchen area, for the back door. It was a fatal mistake. The creature moved with a speed that defied its bulk. It didn't climb through the window. It lunged, a blur of dark fur and muscle that covered the 10 feet to Brian in an instant. One of its long arms shot out, and the large clawed hand closed around Brian's chest. It lifted him off his feet as if he weighed nothing. Brian made a choked, gurgling sound. There was a sickening wet crunch of bone, and then he was silent.
The creature held him for a moment before casually tossing his limp body aside. He landed in a heap by the cold fireplace, unmoving. The sight of Brian's death broke the spell. A white, hot rage surged through me, eclipsing the fear. This thing had just murdered a man in front of me. "Shoot!" I screamed at Jake. We both opened fire. The cabin erupted in a deafening roar as our shotguns discharged. I was using number 4 buckshot, heavy loads meant for taking down deer. I saw my pattern hit the creature square in its massive chest. It grunted, staggering back a step. Jake's shot hit it in the shoulder. The force spun it slightly, but it didn't go down. It growled, a low, furious sound, and looked at us, those glowing amber eyes filled with a terrifying mixture of pain and rage. It wasn't just a dumb animal. It understood what we were, what our weapons were. It ducked back out of the broken window, and for a moment, we had a reprieve. "Reload!" I yelled, my hands shaking as I fumbled for more shells. The smell of cordite filled the air, mingling with the creature's foul stench. My ears were ringing from the blast. "Is he?" Jake started to ask, his voice cracking as he glanced at Brian's still form. "He's gone, son," I said, my voice hard. "Load your weapon. It's not done." We had maybe 30 seconds before the next attack. Another crash came from the side of the cabin as a second window shattered. It was creating another angle of attack, trying to flank us. It was thinking, strategizing. I shoved the heavy oak table on its side, creating a makeshift barricade. "Get behind this," I ordered Jake. We crouched behind the overturned table, our shotguns pointed at the 2 broken windows. The silence stretched again,
but this time it was filled with a dreadful anticipation. We were trapped. It was outside, circling us, testing us.
We heard it moving, heavy footsteps crunching on the gravel outside, then on the wooden porch. It was toying with us. A heavy rock the size of my head suddenly flew through the first broken window and smashed into the stone fireplace, showering sparks. Then, a voice. A garbled, deep, mocking imitation of a human voice. From the darkness outside the second window it whispered, "Help me." It was a grotesque mimicry of Brian's last moments, a psychological attack. Jake let out a sob of rage and fired a blind shot through the window. "Don't waste the shells," I barked. "Only shoot if you have a clear target." We were limited on ammunition. I had 2 boxes of shells in the cabin, 50 rounds total. We'd already fired 4. It felt like nowhere near enough. The creature's intelligence was its most terrifying quality. It wasn't just a monster, it was a hunter. It knew we were cornered. It began to push against the wall of the cabin, and the entire structure groaned.
The logs were thick, but the sheer force being applied was immense. Dust and bits of dried chinking rained down from the ceiling. It was trying to break the cabin apart. It stopped pushing, and a new sound began. A rhythmic, heavy thudding against the front door. It was using something as a battering ram. I risked a quick look over the table. Through the broken window, I could see it. A dark shape in the moonlight, holding a massive log from my woodpile and swinging it against the heavy oak door. The door shuddered with each impact, the iron hinges screaming in protest. Thud, thud, thud. "It's going to break it down," Jake said, his voice laced with despair. "Let it try," I said, trying to project a confidence I didn't feel. My mind was racing, trying to find a way out. There was no way out. The back door was our only other exit, and we had no way of knowing if it was waiting there. Our truck was parked 50 yards away, across an open clearing. We'd never make it. With a final, splintering crack, the top hinge of the door gave way. Another blow, and the bottom hinge ripped free from the frame. The heavy oak door, my fortress gate, toppled inward with a deafening crash, landing flat on the floor. The doorway was open. The creature stood there, framed by the night, the log still in its hands. It dropped the log, which landed with a heavy thud on the porch, and stepped inside. It was wounded. Dark blood was matted in the fur on its chest and shoulder, and it moved with a slight limp, but it was still coming. It took a step into the room, its head low, its amber eyes scanning the space, fixing on our position behind the table. It let out another low growl, a promise of violence. We were out of options. This was it. Fight or die. "On my count," I whispered to Jake. "Aim for the head. 3, 2. Before I could say 1, Jake did something I never would have expected. With a desperate yell, he stood up and hurled the lit kerosene lamp. It flew in a high arc, trailing a tail of flame, and shattered against the creature's chest. The effect was instantaneous. Kerosene splashed across its fur, and the thing went up like a torch. It shrieked, a sound of agony and fury that was 1,000 times worse than its growl. It was a sound that didn't belong in this world. Engulfed in fire, it thrashed wildly, a pillar of writhing, screaming flame. It stumbled backward, smashing into the wall. The dry old logs and the curtains on the remaining window caught fire immediately. "Now!" I screamed. "The back door, go!" This was our only chance. The creature was a raging inferno of pain, completely disoriented. It wasn't thinking about us anymore. It blindly crashed its way back out the ruined doorway, a comet of fire that disappeared into the night.
its shrieks echoing as it fled towards the swamp. The cabin was filling with thick, black smoke. Flames were already licking up the walls.
We couldn't go out the front. The doorway was a wall of fire. I grabbed Jake by the arm and dragged him towards the kitchen. We fumbled with the bolt on the back door, our hands clumsy with adrenaline and fear. I wrenched it open and we stumbled out into the cool night air, coughing and gasping. We didn't look back. We ran. We sprinted across the clearing towards my truck, our lungs burning. I fumbled for the keys in my pocket, my fingers feeling like useless sausages. I dropped them. Damn it, I swore, scrambling on the ground in the dark. Jake found them first, his hand closing over mine. He shoved them into my palm. We piled into the truck. I jammed the key into the ignition and twisted. The old engine turned over once, twice, then caught with a roar. I slammed it into drive and stomped on the gas. The tires spun in the gravel, then gripped, and we shot forward, leaving the burning cabin behind us. The 5-mile drive down that gravel road was the longest of my life.
I had the pedal to the floor, the truck rattling and bouncing over the ruts. Every shadow that flickered in the headlights was the creature. Every snap of a twig in the woods was its footstep. In the rearview mirror, the orange glow of my burning cabin lit up the sky, a funeral pyre for my sanctuary and for Brian. Jake was silent beside me, staring straight ahead, his face a pale, grim mask in the dashboard light. He was bleeding from a cut on his forehead where a piece of the window had hit him, but I don't think he even noticed. We were both convinced it was behind us, that at any moment a huge, dark shape would crash out of the trees and land on the hood. I didn't slow down, not even for the sharp turns. We fishtailed wildly, nearly sliding into a ditch twice, but I held on, my knuckles white on the steering wheel. We burst out onto the paved state highway, the tires chirping on the asphalt. Only then did I ease up on the gas. I didn't stop, though. I drove for another 10 miles, until the comforting blue and red lights of a 24-hour gas station appeared in the distance. I pulled in, killed the engine, and we just sat there for a full minute, the ticking of the cooling engine the only sound. I was the first to speak. My voice was a raw, hoarse whisper. "It's over." Jake just shook his head slowly, still staring out the windshield. "What was that thing, Art?" I had no answer. I still don't. I called 911 from the payphone at the gas station. I was a mess, covered in soot, my clothes torn. I probably sounded like a lunatic, but I used my old credentials. I told them my name, my former badge number, and that there had been a fatal accident and a fire at my cabin. A sheriff's deputy met us at the emergency room of the nearest county hospital. He was young, maybe 25, with a polite but skeptical face. Jake was getting the gash on his forehead stitched up, so I gave the initial statement. I tried to be as calm and factual as possible. I told him about the noise, the moved table, the attack. I described the creature in detail, its size, its shape, the canine head, the impossible speed and intelligence. The deputy wrote it all down in his little notebook, his expression never changing. When I was done, he looked up at me. "Mr. Coleman," he said, his voice gentle, like he was talking to a confused old man. "You've all been through a major trauma. A cabin fire, the loss of your friend. The mind can play tricks on you in a situation like that." "It wasn't a trick," I said, my voice rising. "There was a creature. It killed Brian. It attacked us." "We'll send a team out at first light," he said, a placating tone in his voice. "We'll investigate thoroughly. For now, you just focus on getting checked out. We'll take your official statement later." The official statement was a waste of breath. The next day, a detective, older and more cynical, interviewed us separately. I told my story again. Jake told his. They listened. They nodded.
And then they told us the preliminary findings. The fire was determined to have been caused by an overturned kerosene lamp. Accidental. Brian's body was recovered.
The cause of death was listed as animal attack and blunt force trauma. An animal attack? I asked, incredulous. What kind of animal? The detective shrugged. County coroner thinks a black bear. A big one, maybe rabid. They can be unpredictable, known to get aggressive. It likely wandered into the cabin after the fire started, got confused, and attacked your friend. It happens. A bear tore my front door off its hinges? A bear tried to turn the doorknob? A bear threw a rock through my window? I was nearly shouting. Look at the evidence! The fire destroyed most of the scene, Art, he said, using my first name as if we were old friends. It's hard to say what's fire damage and what's something else. We found some large, non-human prints near the creek bed, but they were washed out. Could be a bear. Honestly, it's the only explanation that makes any sense. The case was closed. Accidental fire. Bear attack. Tragic, but explainable.
My 35 years of service, my reputation for being level-headed and observant, meant nothing. I was just another old man with a wild story. They treated me with a kind of professional pity that was worse than outright disbelief. A week later, I got a call. It was from a man named Marcus Thorne, an old friend who is now a senior park ranger, a supervisor for the whole region. He was one of the few people I still knew who worked the wild places.
Art, he said, his voice low and somber. I heard about your cabin and about the boy, Brian. I'm damn sorry. Thanks, Marcus, I said, my voice flat. They're calling it a bear. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Yeah, he finally said. I read the report. He hesitated, then seemed to make a decision. Listen to me, Art. Don't go back out there. You sell that land. Don't ever go back to that edge of the swamp. Why? I asked, a spark of hope igniting in me. You know something, don't you? I know stories, he said, his voice barely a whisper. Unofficial stories. Things that get reported but never written down. Disappearances, strange sightings, especially in that area. We call it the dead zone among ourselves. There are places in this world, Art, that are older and stranger than we are. You stumbled into one of them. You were lucky to get out. Most aren't. So take the win and walk away. And that was it. A cryptic warning from an old friend. A private acknowledgement that I wasn't crazy, but a public and official denial that left me completely alone with the truth. It was a cold, bitter comfort. I sold the land. I couldn't bear the thought of going back. Jake and Alyssa moved to Oregon the following year. He never spoke of that night again, not to me, not to his wife. It was a black hole in our lives that we both tacitly agreed never to approach. But I see the shadow of it in his eyes whenever we talk on the phone. I see the same haunted look I see in my own reflection. I live in town now, a small house in a quiet subdivision with streetlights that stay on all night. I can't stand the dark anymore, or the silence. I sleep with the television on. Some nights I wake up in a cold sweat, the memory of those glowing amber eyes burning in my mind. I can still hear its shriek, that unholy mix of animal and something else. I can still smell the burning fur and the rot. I can still see Brian, lifted into the air as if he were a doll. Survivor's guilt is a heavy burden. Why me and Jake? Why not him? I spent my whole life believing I understood the natural world. I believed in biology, in ecology, in the neat, orderly classifications of science. I thought the monsters were all in the storybooks. But I was wrong.
The world is not what we think it is. The maps have blank spaces, and in those spaces things still lurk. Things that have been here far longer than us. Things that hunt by rules we don't understand. So now, I'm just an old man with a story no one believes. A man who is afraid of the dark. I am telling you this for one reason. If you are ever in the woods, deep in the wild places, and the world goes silent around you, leave. Don't rationalize. Don't try to be brave. Don't wait to find out why. Just turn around and walk away. Heed the warning signs. I didn't, and I paid a price that can never be repaid.
I lost a friend. I lost my peace of mind. And I lost the world I thought I knew. All that's left is the memory and the warning.